as we expected that, Professor Nancy Wright, US writer, is with us. We are very thankful to him, having you here.
Thank you.
Though in a busy schedule, we know it that, but we have to, benefit the expansion, but because of that, we are in this service we are having. So I welcome you to this special talk by Professor Nancy Wright, US Fulbright, and I welcome you all, especially Professor Espati, ex-dean of School of Social Sciences. Whenever we call, he used to be with us, and he's a leading star among us, and we are following his footsteps. And my dean of, being the dean of the School of Social Sciences, I welcome you all. And the head of the department, Professor, Reddy is very much with us here. He is the head of the Department of Political Science. And Professor Deva also with us. He is the head of the Department of Social Work. And Professor Orosana is a senior professor in our department. And all our other colleagues are here. Thank you so much. And from other, faculty members of social sciences are here, and very soon some other faculty members from other departments also going to join us. And today we are very lucky that so many places that some kind of international conference and some international workshops simultaneously going on somewhere. And because of that, although all of them wanted to join us, but that still doesn't permit them to join us here. But anyway, we have, I think, sufficient number of participants, and all of them are here, eagerly waiting for your lecture. Yeah. So today our theme is going to be synthesizing analysis, critique, creativity, and reflection in the social sciences research. So we are the social sciences scientists and social sciences students and faculty members here. So we are going to be, that's the theme says so. It is social sciences research, and because of that, we are going to benefit a lot from you. I know it then. Synthesizing, many of us knowing that it is the combination of two or more. Am I right? Two or more. Yeah.
Okay.
Two or more items into a new whole.
Oh yes, synthesizing. Yes.
That is the synthesize. Okay. Earlier things are there, maybe many things are there, but we do not know they have their own way of doing that. But in the synthesize, we are trying to put together to have a better one, which we never had before. And this is, and then cognitive psychology rightly say that whole is better than part. You all know it that whole is better than part. So synthesizing today, we are going to hear from that. That's right. And the other thing also, we are going to from how we are going to learn that how to do that analysis in that qualitative research.
Yes.
Yeah. This is very important. Today we are talking about the qualitative and quantitative researches. And today, most of us are learning about the quantitative, but today we are going to pay attention or focus to that qualitative analysis. And because of that, it's going to be very, very interesting. Yeah. This is going to be, especially for the psychologists, it's going to be very, very interesting. And others also, most of them are doing the qualitative research. Okay, thank you so much for that, selecting the theme. Thank you so much. And now, since our time is too tight, so I would like to call that Dr. Fente, Professor Fente, to introduce that resource person and also to do whatever she wants to do. So let me call that Professor Fente.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank each and every one of you to have made the time to be here in order to, I would say, grow our minds, especially in the area of research methodology that we are not very, very familiar with. In the social sciences, many of us are engaged in mostly in quantitative methodology, and of course, at least half of the departments in the social sciences are engaged in qualitative methods as well to go with the quantification. So we are very, very eager to learn the new methods and the alternative ways of looking at things, like how to synthesize all the aspects of data that is collected through reflections, through all those that Professor Nancy Wright will be talking about. And we're very pleased to have Professor Nancy Wright. And as a token of our gratitude, I would like to invite one of our students, Michelle, to give away a miso bag, a typical miso bag to Professor Nancy Wright, please. Professor, may I kindly stand?
It's not good to block the dean. I know that. One of the rules, never block the dean. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I am here to introduce. Okay. Without further ado, I would like to read out, because when I try to talk impromptu, I just go off the bit, so due to the time constraints also, I'll be just reading her brief bio. Professor Nancy Wright, she's the Fulbright Nehru Academic and Professional Excellence Award in Teaching. She's hosted by the University of Calcutta in West Bengal. And her field of study is international relations principally, but not only. Her home university is Long Island University, Brooklyn campus in Brooklyn, New York. She is here on her Fulbright spell for 9 months, and she has just completed her 9 months. Dr. Nancy Wright holds a Master of Philosophy in Political Science as well from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, a Master of Science in Political Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a Bachelor of Arts with honors in History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She teaches international relations and comparative politics at Long Island University's Brooklyn campus in Brooklyn, New York, where she has designed and taught graduate and undergraduate seminars on small states in international relations. That is why she has been around us, even to Bhutan and all the other areas in the Northeast. She is also expert in environmental sustainability and various aspects of the United Nations system, including the role and office of the United Nations Secretary General. In 2012, she was a Fulbright visiting lecturer in international relations at the same university, that is Calcutta in Alipore. She has written a book, Earth Fables, which combines poetry, short stories, and short analytical pieces to encourage a synthesis of critical, analytical, creative, and reflective background. Dr. Wright has held positions with several New York City agencies, including the Guarda Management Fellowship and with the United Nations Association, and the International Peace Academy. On her Fulbright Nehru grant, Dr. Wright is teaching a combination of courses in international relations and comparative politics, including a focus on small sovereign state in international relations, environmental sustainability, like I mentioned before, and the United Nations and all those, international relations from the global south, and all of that. Now, key concepts throughout her pedagogy are the complexity and geographical essence of sustainability, including the challenge of climate change and the importance of incorporating numerous professional disciplines and methodologies in research and analysis. So I'm very happy to call upon Professor Nancy Wright to share with us her expertise, and perhaps we could have discussions if we have the time later on, because there are many other areas in which she is also an expert in, besides the area that she is going to lecture on today. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that very gracious introduction, both by the Dean and by Dr. Fente, who has been my most gracious host since I arrived here day before yesterday. And I have learned so much about Mizoram and Aizawl just in the past 36 hours. Much has been from spending some time with Professor Fente. And on the way over, I was saying, I want to spend more time, have more discussions with you. So I'm sure that would be true of everyone here if I had the time, and I do hope to return to this part of India. I really enjoyed it immensely. As was mentioned, and I must say, where those areas that I was, she said I was an expert, let's just say I have many interests. So I don't know that I would count as expertise my involvement with the numerous fields, but I have many interests, but thank you for that. Yeah, Earth Fables, I brought a copy with me, and if anybody wants me to read a short portion for it at the end, if we have time after discussion, I'm happy to do that. That's really up to you. I will talk a little about how I ended up writing Earth Fables, and it has to do with synthesizing these different approaches to thinking. And it's from a point of departure in that for most of my life, or really all of my life, I've been balancing between the creative and the analytical. And the creative and expressive really came first. I learned the analytical skills a bit later. I was not at first as analytical. But they're all very important, and I find they can strengthen each other when they are all engaged. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Just so that we have a common definition, I tend to think of analytical approaches as having to do with data, with hypothesizing, sort of standard scientific method. You hypothesize, you seek information that either supports or refutes your hypothesis. Hopefully you retain an open mind as a researcher, so you don't do what in social sciences is called selecting on the dependent variable, which means looking only for information that supports your hypothesis and somehow screening out any that doesn't and ignoring it. That's not good social science research. So hopefully people don't do that, even if it means you have to revise your hypothesis. It can actually bring about a more interesting piece of work. By the way, I'll interrupt myself just to say, around my friends at home, I tend to talk fast. And so if I'm talking too fast, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, or one of you tell me, slow down, because when I get excited about topics, I talk fast. I really talk fast. And she can attest to, we had dinner last night, and she can attest to the fact I talk fast. So if I start talking too fast, I will not be at all offended if you raise your hand and say, please slow down. And I don't know anything in Mizo, so so I apologize that I cannot give this talk in Mizo. But then critical thinking, I always associate with being able to read with a critical eye. It has to do not as much with data gathering, but with just whatever you are reading or hearing or discussing, you keep that incisive mentality, so you're aware of internal contradictions. I'm sure you've always been in conversation with someone at some point where what the person says, the person contradicts it almost in the same breath but doesn't realize it. Not everyone has that self-awareness, and I think as social scientists, it's very important to have that. Creative thinking, of course, we associate it with writing fiction, poetry, sculpting, painting, dancing, singing, playing instruments. All of that is creative. But it also, and that's all important, and I have some of that in Earth Fables. In fact, the cornerstone of that is creative work. But it also has to do with bringing a creative approach to research that's being done, and then synthesizing that with the rigor and the rigor and the legitimacy that we know we have to bring to our research, and just some small exercises that can sort of inspire creative thinking. When I go to academic conferences, I try to make it a point to go to at least 1 or 2 sessions that have nothing to do with anything I've ever done. You know, I love to just go to a session that has nothing to do with anything I've ever researched or studied. And even if I don't follow all of it, and even if I risk asking a question that might seem rather ignorant, I'll take that chance, because often there's something that'll come out of that I'll think, oh, there's a relationship with some of the things that I do. And so that's one way, without having to travel long distances. If you're at a conference anyway, if you can talk to people or attend a session that's out of your research area, if you have the time, that's something I try to do, and I enjoy doing that. I will return to this business of creative thinking with respect to how we can learn more about subjects about which we have little information. I'll return to that. But just the last one, reflective thinking, which is sometimes called meta-learning. There's a wonderful book by Donald Schoen. It was published probably 30-some years ago now. It's a classic. It's called The Reflective Practitioner. And all of that has to do with understanding how and why we learn what we learn. And as researchers, that's very important, because the beginning, I would say, is knowing, first of all, why you're choosing the subject you're choosing. You usually find information about that in the prefaces of books. Always read the preface, because that way you know why the writer is writing what the writer is writing. Sometimes it's to fill a research gap. Sometimes it's inspired by something that happened in one's personal life. Sometimes it's family genealogy, and someone stumbles on something and notices that the biography of this person has yet to be written. So that's the project. So that's something that I very much encourage people constantly be thinking about why you're studying and researching what you're studying and researching, and be aware of certain twists and turns, detours you may end up taking, and what the importance of those is. So taking those 4 approaches, I wrote Earth Fables, and what I do is I introduce each chapter with a creative piece, it's either a poem or a short story. And then that's followed by a description of the topic, and in the case where countries are featured, there is a historical sketch, very brief, not comprehensive, just a kind of overall sketch of the country. And all the countries that I have chapters on in here, it's Lesotho, Bhutan, Bolivia, Kyrgyzstan, and Vanuatu. So they're all small countries. Don't have it on India, but I do have a piece on Bhutan in here, so not too far away. What I do is I take the creative pieces, and they introduce the topic, and then I have the historical sketches or the descriptions of the topics, and I close with what I call questions for reflection and discussion. And I emphasize both reflection and discussion because they're questions that I hope whoever reads the book will be asking himself or herself, in addition to doing it collectively. So I'm going to just give you a few examples of how I feel these types of thinking can be synthesized. They're examples from my own teaching. They're examples from my non-academic life with New York City government. I'll give one example from that. And it's something that I have just found. I think a lot of times we may do it more subconsciously than we realize, but then that means it's not as systematic as it might be. But just my first example, anybody who studies public policy from a political science perspective will know that one of the key ideas discussed is how do you distinguish a problem from a condition? When does a condition become a problem? And there are all sorts of theories on this. And it's important because people live with conditions all the time and just accept them. And the classic textbook case in the US is the Great Depression, that unemployment prior to the Great Depression was considered an individual problem. Often the individual was blamed for the unemployment. You know, well, the person's lazy, unreliable, can't hold a job. You know, this was the sort of the stigma. But when the Great Depression happened and so many people were unemployed, you couldn't say that much of the population was lethargic or unreliable. You know you have a policy problem. Smoking, another aspect is there are smoking laws. We, about 20-some years ago, we implemented no smoking laws where you have to have designated places to smoke, and it's by law, and some places are smoke-free, and it's absolute law. And before that, it was a condition where if you didn't smoke and you went to eat somewhere, and they might have a smoking section like there, and non-smoking was here, it didn't really help. You were breathing the secondhand smoke, even without smoking. Well, a lot of that stopped, because there was a lot of pressure to stop it. And so another way that a condition becomes a problem is when people are determined, there's a group of people determined enough to solve the problem. And so those kinds of things take on dimensions that they require more than just gathering data. It requires looking at the source of the problem, defining the problem, and then recognizing where there are solutions, and also where solutions are implemented. In the course of the implementation, do you end up either creating other problems or solving something that's not the original problem? And so that's where the critical, the analytical, the creative comes into play with creative solutions. Solutions don't come from just analyzing or critiquing. You have to be creative. You have to come up with ideas. They may not be ideal, but ideas. And people have to feel free to express those ideas, even if they seem ridiculous, because some ridiculous ideas end up being works of genius, as we know. And then the reflective thinking, so that you're always going back and saying, now how did we define the problem? Are we defining it the same way? Is the solution that we were originally proposed, is that truly the best solution? So all of those ways of thinking, whether you're a practitioner or whether you're a scholar, they're very important when it comes to problem solving. And I think that among the disciplines, there are anthropologists here, and I once attended a panel with the International Studies Association annual meeting. That's mostly international relations scholars, political scientists that specialize in international relations. Not exclusively, and anyone may come, but it's mostly that. But this panel had anthropologists on it, and one of the anthropologists said, the difference between political scientists and anthropologists in their work is that anthropologists tend to analytically describe and sort of assess what is around them, whereas political scientists are always looking for solutions, recommending things. And a lot of that comes from the fact that political science and policy go together, and also from the fact that political scientists often came into political science because of a concern. It was an interest, but they wanted to improve something. And there are other social scientists that want to improve the world as well, but you do find this. My own experience, I have a great interest in anthropology and history, and I was majoring in those until I got very concerned about nuclear war, and so I switched to political science. But I find that they all work together, and so, not nuclear war, but the other disciplines. And so I'm very happy to be able to teach in an interdisciplinary way, which I think is very important. Moving to this business of creative thinking and then incorporating the critical thinking into it. Some years ago, I designed and taught a course on, I called it Leaders of Expansion and Unification, and there were 6 world leaders that had somewhat, in some cases, they had a kind of mixed reputation of being good leaders and not bad leaders, but some of the things they did, you know, they were revered by some, despised by some, that kind of thing. And among them, I had 5, and they were, well, let's see, it was Genghis Khan, Queen Victoria, Simon Bolivar, Tecumseh, who was a Shawnee leader who tried to unify the Shawnee nation unsuccessfully, unfortunately, and Hatshepsut, who was a female pharaoh in Egypt. And I wanted a sub-Saharan African woman, because I had 3 men and 2 women, and I wanted someone from sub-Saharan Africa. So I Googled, did what we all do, I Googled, right? I Googled pre-20th century African women leaders. I thought that would generate something. Well, it did. It generated many things, but among them was a little volume, a citation of a volume called Pre-20th Century African Women Leaders. The key word was the title of this book. It was by a cultural anthropologist who was deceased even at that time, named David Sweetman, and it gives biographical sketches of 12 pre-20th century African women leaders throughout sub-Saharan, well, all of Africa, because Hatshepsut was there too, and, as well as some from the Maghreb, so it was all of Africa, north and south of the Sahara. And the book was this little, it's one of those little volumes you might find at a used book sale or something. It was just wonderful and intriguing. But I couldn't get a context for it, and I couldn't find out much about David Sweetman. And I perused the bibliography, and a lot of the entries were kind of outdated, it seemed. But the treasure in it was that it gave me the names of these women. So I started Googling each one. And I found an authoritative biography for several of them, and those became the core of another course I taught on pre-20th century African women leaders. Now, what does that have to do with my talk today? For that course, that was an honors undergraduate course, and the theme of it was the subject matter, but also how do we learn more about people about whom we have very little information, or the information we have, the credibility of it, it's hard to test or to evaluate. And I found out from some biographers, one biographer in particular, he's an historian actually, he said Sweetman's work is not all that, you know, you have to be careful how much you rely on it. And so I took that under advisement, and there was no contradiction between the biographical sketches of Sweetman and the longer books, but I took all that under advisement, and still I said, so what can we do? And I think this is so important now that we have the internet, we have Google, we have Wikipedia, we have all of these search engines and ways of quickly finding out things, but we also know we have a very strong cautionary note that we cannot rely on the first thing we see popping up on the screen, and we should never do that. So this synthesis of thinking, if you're a good critical thinker, you look for, okay, like what I did is I looked at the bibliographies in Sweetman's book to see, okay, what does he cite as his works? If I hadn't seen anything, I would have gotten worried. But still, then even if you get a book that you would not want to rely on entirely, does it have something to offer? Yes, this one did. It had the names of 12 women prior to the 20th century who were major leaders in Africa that I'm not an Africanist, but a lot of Africanists had not heard of these leaders. So yes, I was enlightened. So sources, you can still get good things from sources that are not entirely reliable. Just, we have to be careful. We have to be very careful about what we rely on. So that became part of the course as well. And so what I encourage the students to do, I said, where we do not have much information about these women, can you write a creative piece? Can you imagine a dialogue? Can you write a poem? You know, and that's what happened. And we had this kind of multimedia presentation that we gave to Brooklyn Tech High School students, and it was really great. We had a wonderful time doing it. And one could then ask, what is the larger significance of this? Well, I introduced some of these women in a course I taught just last year that I titled Marginalization of People, Places, and Events in History. It's the course is a social science capstone course that's required of all social science undergraduate majors at my home university. The theme changes. It's chosen by the instructor, and I chose marginalization. And so I included a few of these women. And there was a young woman who wrote, I always ask for the take-home exam final at the end of semester. I always say, please identify and explain 5 things you learned in this course. And I caution them. I say, this is not a throwaway question. Please do not just list 5 words. I want to know what you learned and why it's important to you. And one of the women wrote that reading about these pre-20th century African women leaders, and she really highlighted Hatshepsut, the Egyptian pharaoh, she said, made her feel more empowered. So she drew some kind of strength from reading about people centuries ago halfway around the world. So the larger significance of this is very important. And just to give you another example from my own country, Crispus Attucks was the first American killed in the American Revolution. He was an African-American slave. There is some discussion that he may have been a fugitive because there was a posting wanted a fugitive slave named Crispus, which was spelled a little differently. We know almost nothing about Crispus Attucks. We know he was a dock worker, he was a merchant sailor sometimes. We know almost nothing about his life. However, he has been invoked during so much of American history, particularly where African Americans have made noteworthy contributions to history. And he's like this, his image is like this continuum. And it's really interesting. There's a new biography that just came out. It's a biography, but it's it's more a biography of his image throughout history that came out just in June of this year. And it's called, I've got the complete title here, it's, let's see, it's, I might have written it at a different place, I'll come across it if I did. But First Martyr of Liberty is the title of it. And what this author does is he starts with Crispus Attucks during the Boston Massacre, and then each chapter is where Crispus Attucks is largely forgotten, then he's brought back into the American collective memory, and of course, former President Barack Obama, there was a reference to Crispus Attucks when Obama was inaugurated to show this continuum. So subject matter can have great power over time, even when we don't know much detail about a person's life or about an event, what actually happened. It becomes very momentous, and that's very important. Are you all familiar with the work of Joseph Campbell? He wrote a whole series, and there was an interview series on public broadcasting in the US called The Power of Myth. It was with Bill Moyers. He was the journalist who interviewed him. And it's about how myth, writ large, is what drives us. Our universal truths are embedded much more in what we would say myth, but not myth as in falsehood, myth as in faith-based knowledge. That drives us much more than data, oftentimes, okay? So it has to be accounted for. And the tricky thing is, how do you account for this very nebulous body of insight that you can't prove, but it's so important? And in faith-based professions, that the say would go on faith, right? But we know that's very subjective. So when we're trying to be social scientists, we don't want to be so subjective. We don't want to run the risk of losing credibility. And we don't want to run the risk of making erroneous inferences because we're too subjective. So we have to balance that. And one of the great ways to balance it is knowing that we are always subjective, that we always bring ourselves to our research. It's always partly about us. No matter what we're looking at, it's about us because we are the ones conducting the research. And so there's a saying, I believe Virginia Woolf is the one who said it, and I was trying to verify that earlier, and I'm pretty sure I couldn't find her name with the quote, but I've seen it before. But you can quote the quote, don't quote that Virginia Woolf said it, but I'm almost positive she was the one who did, who said all biography is fiction. Why? Because the biographer brings self to the subject. If you're doing a biography of somebody who lived 200 years ago, you are bringing a 21st century view to that person who lived 200 years ago. You can't help that. No one can help that. So, and also, even if you could write as and interpret the person from an 18th century perspective, for example, then people now probably would not understand a lot of what's written. So we have to have that relationship. It's always a relationship. So, and I'll tell you, so there is this idea that all biography is fiction, at least has large elements of fiction. Conversely, there has been, as you probably know, over the past, probably 10 or 15 years now, an attempt to move international relations scholarship, which is more of my background, away from being very Anglo-American centered and looking at other theories, other approaches to understanding international relations. And there was one compendium that opened, the contributor said that sometimes she can learn more about a country or place, society, from a novel than from a monograph, a research monograph. And we know this can be true because the novel describes, anybody might say, yes, but the novel is subjective. Again, the research monograph is subjective too, it's just subjective in a different way. Now, what are some differences? A good research monograph should have citations. So you'll have footnotes, you'll have references. So yes, there are important differences. And I'm not suggesting that if your professor asks you to write a research paper that you turn in a novel instead, at least not without getting prior clearance on that. That could get you in big trouble. That could be worse than blocking the dean. Certain things are not good. So I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting that we can think creatively, and perhaps, after you finish the research paper or finish your degree, you might want to look at it and think, are there any creative works you could generate from this? Is there any kind of interpretive dance that your conclusions could suggest, or a painting or a poem that your conclusions could suggest, and then that could be your further expression. It's just an idea to keep creative learning at the forefront, creative thinking at the forefront. I'll just quickly give you an example of my own experience with that. Way back my senior year in high school, it was long before you all were born. We did have electricity, but it was long before you were born. A teacher told me about a book by Nicholas Montserrat called the Catalan of Malta. It was written in the 70s. And you can still get it online, at least Amazon. I don't know about Amazon India, but I know you can get it. It costs next to nothing now because it's so old, you know, and you get a used copy. But it's wonderful. It's the story of this priest in Malta during World War II. And if you know about the geostrategic position of Malta, it's an island, it's a tiny island, it's a microstate, fewer than 500,000 people, halfway between Tripoli and Rome. And I had the chance to go to Malta many years ago. It was after I read this book. But one of the most amusing things that I encountered, I got in on a Saturday night, and first thing Sunday morning, you'll appreciate this being from Mizoram, I headed to church. It was the early Mass, and Malta is very deeply Roman Catholic, and the early Mass, and I kept hearing people say, grazie Allah, and I realized this is what happens when you're halfway between Rome and Tripoli. Your language has this mixture of Arabic and Italian. It was really interesting to hear. But because of its location, it was with the British, it was with the Allied forces, but it got pummeled by bombs from every side. And this novel is about this priest. They had these catacombs, and where they buried people, and people would hide underground during the blitzes. And the chapel and the priest would be down there with them, and he would tell them stories of Malta's history to keep their hopes alive. And this novel, it goes from a chapter of history to the contemporary time, back to history, back to contemporary during World War II. And it's really informative, and it's just an engaging read. It's just absolutely wonderful. And when I had the chance to go to Malta just for a few days, 10 years later, I was presenting a paper it wasn't on Malta, it was on something else. I had arrived and I was in the capital of Valletta, outside the hotel grounds. And it was early evening, and there was this kind of gnarled little man standing there. He didn't speak much English, but I managed to communicate, and I asked if he had worked at the hotel a long time. Oh no, 2 years. And I said, where did you work before that? He said, I work in docks. I worked in docks 40 years, all during war. And then there was this pause, and he said, war, bad, very bad, too many bombs on Malta. And it was like the whole novel from 10 years ago just came back, like, you know, it was like the most incredible understanding through those few words, you know, of what he was saying, the gravitas with which he said those words. It was just incredible. And so, you know, you could hypothesize from that, do some kind of study about post-war trauma. It could be very valuable. But that's where I think the decision has to be made. Is that the best approach to taking something creative and researching it? Or perhaps do we live with an intuitive knowledge? How could people not be traumatized? You know, there is a Mastodome Cathedral in Malta also where this missile came through and never went off, and it's been preserved. It skidded all along the floor during Mass. This was during the war. You know, so I mean, you can, at what point can we say this cannot not have had a tremendous impact on this island and its people? Do we want to interview people, have questionnaires, do some kind of regression analysis? Maybe, maybe not. But those are the decisions we make as researchers. And what is so valuable, I think, about bringing creativity into it is that we may end up with a new enlightenment that is even more valuable than the data gathering. For that case, not for everything. The data gathering is still very important. Another area, the quantitative and qualitative methods were mentioned in the introduction, and I'm so glad, and I'm very glad to hear that you are engaging in both. They are both very important. I will readily tell you that I do not do quantitative analysis. I have had minimal exposure to it. I always encourage my students to expose themselves to it, to take at least one course in statistics, statistical methods, because, among other things, I don't do it. I don't really care to do it, but I do not want to impose that bias on someone else. I'm always reminded of the time that I asked someone there was a choice of a stir fry with tofu or chicken. I said, do you recommend the tofu or the chicken? She was familiar with the food in this particular place. She said, oh, the chicken, definitely. I said, why? Why do you say that? Because I hate tofu. Well, that's not a good basis for recommendation, okay? So, you know, I don't want to do the same thing. I'm not saying I hate quantitative analysis. I don't care for it. I do not want to impose that bias here. I encourage everyone, if you are doing it, continue doing it. If you are not doing it, talk to people who do it. Definitely make it a part of your life to the point where you can decide on your own whether this is a good, whether this works for you as a researcher. But I will say that creative thinking can have a very interesting impact, I think, in as much as that we will say, okay, all biography is fiction. We can say novels instruct. We can say those things. We also can say that in as much as quantitative analysis imparts a certain precision, that precision itself contains a type of fiction in that it is a distortion. It has to be. Any kind of research has a certain amount of distortion to it because we cannot take the whole, what is a data set? It's a representative sample, right? If you want to find out about the impact of the floods in Assam on farmers, okay? Are you going to be able to interview every single farming household in Assam that may or may not have been impacted? No, because by the time you do that, your data will be too old from the first set, right? So you get a representative sample. So when I say distortion, I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying that is necessary. That's why you want to be careful to get a representative sample. So you'd want to interview some people from certain parts of Assam that had more flooding, certain that had less. And I don't know I just know the floods happen. I read about them in the media, that's all I know. I'm giving it just as an example. Might not be a good example, but I think you get my point. That any kind of sample is a type of distortion, but it's necessary because you cannot interview everyone. You cannot do research on everything that pertains to your subject. It has to be, you have to make those choices. That's where the reflective thinking comes in. What is driving your choices? So that said, in international relations, we certainly distort because we cannot hold the globe in the palm of our hand and see, you know, what is going on at any given time. So we come up with theories, concepts, analytical frameworks, and there are a lot of quantitative methods employed in international relations, and I think maybe even more in international relations than some fields. Why? Because we cannot, it is so large. There is no way you can do a kind of global interview set. I mean, there are research teams that do that, and they have people going all over the world, huge research teams, but generally we have to distort with some kind of model. And the models are fine, except I'll give you an example, two examples where one, a long time ago, I was at a conference and the keynote speaker is very deeply engaged in quantitative analysis. And he was giving his keynote on the elegance and precision of mathematical language in analyzing phenomena, international relations phenomena, war, peace, conflict. And at the end of it, I asked him, I said, I understand what you mean about the elegance and precision of the language, but does that mean that you're necessarily getting a more precise explanation? And he didn't really answer the question, but afterwards, several people came up to me and said, I'm so glad you asked that. Well, you know, this is a complex situations, conflict, protracted conflict, persistent poverty, structural violence, if we borrow Johan Galtung's term. I mean, all of those things, they are very complicated, thorny, very untidy situations. So they're not going to be encapsulated in a model. So yes, we may want to code certain things. I mean, just like when you're evaluating, you know, when people say, how was your experience with this airline or whatever, or make my trip, you know, 1 to 5, you know, very poor, excellent. Of course we do that, and that's fine. But that's to gauge a specific thing, and you still are going to have some distortion because people are not always sure which number to press. So certainly a model is not going to tell you but so much about that reality. And it can help to simplify, to begin to understand, but if you stop with that, then it's a kind of self-deception. I'll give you another example. I was at another regional conference, and there were 2 of us faculty members and 2 graduate students. I did not teach either of the graduate students. I didn't know them. But the panel was these 2 graduates. It's kind of funny because the faculty member and I, our papers were presentable, but we had little gaps here and there. You know, the graduate students, every I was dotted, every T was crossed. They were the neatest papers, just so put together, because, you know, this was a really major, they were presenting their research that was probably preliminary for their doctoral thesis. And one of them presented, he used a game theory model to explain the Kashmir conflict. Well, I know about Kashmir what the average person knows. I have not studied Kashmir. I mean, I'm somewhat familiar. Unfortunately, I didn't learn anything more from his presentation. And at the end, the discussant said, I hate to have to break this news to you, but Kashmir is about more than 2 parties. There are more than 2 actors involved in this conflict. And he had this whole game theory, n equals this, and n equals 2, and 2n, and all. I don't do game theory, so I don't even know. You know, I know what it is, but that's it. And it was, you know, all of this work he had done, and it didn't tell anybody a thing about Kashmir, but he had his model. So, you know, a creative thinker recognized that that model is a creative work. Now, if you want to create that, that's fine, but it should be recognized as a creative device that the researchers come up with, and it may not work to explain something. That's where the critical thinking comes in, the reflective thinking. The analytical thinking, you may just need more data, and that model may not be able to accommodate that data. Well, which goes? Do you reject the data, or do you reject the model? I mean, the model is supposed to be the tool. So if you hang on too much to that model, like it's some kind of mantra or something, then you're going to lose sight of what you're looking at. So that's something to be careful of, and I think synthesizing these various ways of thinking can help to do that. Just a couple of other examples, and there are a couple of books that have come out recently on climate change. One of them came out just last year, and it's co-authored by Sanjay Chaturvedi and Timothy Doyle. It's called Climate Terror, A Critical Geopolitics of Climate Change. Some of you may be familiar with it. What's really interesting, it's the first critical geographical look at the whole climate change debate. And basically their argument is that all of this urgency, this idea of climate Armageddon, that, you know, the world is just going to, you know, implode because of all of this, is that the truth is the poorest of the poor in the global south, and for that matter in the global north, are experiencing these hardships all the time. It's not like there's some doomsday that's going to come soon. It's been there for them for years, for generations. And a lot of our climate change debate has become ensconced. I mean, the high-level debate is at these UN climate change conferences. And that, I mean, there are people who make jokes. I mean, people who are cynical about all this will say, why are you spending all those resources holding a conference at some elite hotel that's using up a lot of energy to talk about not using energy? I mean, this is the kind of circular logic that comes around. One could justify that we need the heads of state to come together. They have to come together in a venue that can accommodate them. So maybe this is just what it has to be. But it is important to recognize, and this is where the critical thinking comes in, that the debate about climate change has taken on a life of its own that is not necessarily tied to the people who are the ultimate victims of it. There are all sorts of, as these authors say, imagined geographies that come into speeches and so forth. What's ironic about that book is if you read, after you read it, you sort of feel that the outcome is not dissimilar to Donald Trump walking out on the Paris conference, but for a different reason. You know, so the question becomes, is Trump walking out on climate change, or was he walking out on the climate change conference? Because those conferences have taken on a kind of identity that is not necessarily linked to the worst reality of climate change outcomes. And in a similar vein, John Barnett and John Campbell have written a few years before this, Climate Change and Small Island States, Power, Knowledge, and the South Pacific. And their take on this whole business is, again, but using these case studies of South Pacific islands, that a lot of what people are worried about, they're sinking into the sea because of sea level rising, sea levels rising, and so forth, that actually the way that the responses to climate change coming from these islands the responses are far different from what's being generated from above in these elite circles of diplomats that are discussing climate change. So those are just a couple of examples of the ways that this kind of synthesizing our thinking can lead to research that does make new discoveries and does, it will be a good checklist for whether the model is taking over the research, you know, whether it's more about the model than finding out answers. Also, a lot of times the questions are just as important as the answers, and they raise more questions. And we like to think we can answer things. There are certain things that maybe we cannot answer, and maybe it's more important just to know that the questions are there and to keep seeking answers, but to know that those questions are just as important as the answers. So with that, I can pause. I mean, I can talk more, give a few more examples. I could take questions. If anybody wants me to read a little something from this, I can do that. But I will turn it back over to you all to decide how to spend the rest of the time. I don't even know how much is left.
Thank you so much, Nansira. Such a wonderful lecture. And now, don't you know that how important is that collecting the data? We are employing different kinds of methods, and some methods are giving us some information. And to be able to know that, we have to be, utilizing data, the critic of that, and then to generate new knowledge from that methods, and so that will give us beyond the sums of words, and that which we have never had, that that's a normal adaptation of that. We own that, we can get that new information. So we all know that the kind of method we are using is that. But from the speech of that professor, that's right, we are gain a lot of that. The importance of synthesizing for the social sciences research. Thank you so much, Nancy, right?
Thank you very much.
Okay. So now let's call again that Professor Fende. She would like to do something for the student.
Of course, if there are questions, we can take questions after a while, but I have a very, I'm very eager to announce something because I have found that somebody who is here attending the seminar is someone that the School of Social Sciences is very proud of. There is this student of the Department of Sociology who had participated in the National Youth Debateathon and who has come first along with our student in Economics Department in the Northeastern region. And she's going to represent not only Mizoram but also the Northeastern region in the national debate. Her name is Patrina V. L. Shwaikwami, if I'm not mistaken. So I'd just like to call her, and she's going to, let her say a few words, because only few words, because we know that the buses will be leaving soon. So we only have a few words. So I'm going to allow her that because we're so proud of her.
Thank you so much for giving me the time. So I will just wrap up everything what we have, experienced back there in Guwahati. So the Youth Debateathon has been planned by Plan India, which is the Plan International Federation. They mostly focus on child development organizations. So under two topics, one was the dropout rates, and the other one is teenage child pregnancy. So under that, we had a series of discussions and debates, and from there, 3 persons have been chosen under Northeastern states to represent the problems of the Northeast. So we have drafted a youth charter, which we will take it on to Delhi this coming week. That is on the next month, November 1st to the 3rd. So that is mostly the wrap up of everything. So I hope that everyone could, remember us in your prayers as well. Thank you so much.
We have some refreshment ready to freshen us up, and while that is getting ready, we can open the floor for discussion. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, anything, any doubts, anything that you would like to share, or give a question for Professor Nancy Wright, the time is open. Thank you. Yes, Professor Reddy. Yeah. Come here.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
More than anybody else, as a student of politics, I think I've enjoyed your lecture more. So, no complaints, solely complimenting you. Yes, we had one lecture in our department, but and some international relations are issues related to that. But I have to explore the time and time possibility. If there is one, I'd like to request her.
Yes.
To have one program in our department.
Yes, sir.
Possible.
Okay.
Probably have to be today though, right? It's just tomorrow.
Oh, but she's leaving on Sunday, and tomorrow is Saturday.
Oh, I'll have to come back.
Yeah. Next time she's here, she's already
Next time.
Yeah.
Next time, yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm really honored. I'm very honored.
Yeah, we have got students in international relations.
I mean, I could come over this afternoon after this, but it might be a little short
All of
notice.
the students are almost
Everybody's got, it's Friday, as I understand, it's Friday.
weekend.
Yeah, but thank you for the invitation.
Head of Department of Political Science, and this is Professor Deva, Head of Department of Social Work.
So I would also add what my colleague Professor Reddy said. It's a wonderful lecture on qualitative aspect. Right now we are all venturing in it. So that way it's a really eye-opening for me in a lot of aspects. One thing I would like to ask is a small question with regard to qualitative studies approaches mostly on subjective in nature. How to avoid that subjectivity, because when we do any research, more of objectivity is essential. People will talk, each and every approach is having its own limitations. But to know the reality, to know the truth, it is better to go in objectivity. Therefore, I need from your own experience, how could we avoid the subjectivity?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure it can be avoided altogether. I think recognizing it and stating it. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with stating, what your beliefs are, what your, and this is done. There's a documentary. It actually was. You have Discovery Channel here, I think. It was a documentary about the lost mummy, and it was trying to find Hatshepsut's mummy. And it was a team of archaeologists, Egyptologists and archaeologists, and they had it narrowed down to 4. And there was, at some point during Hatshepsut's life, somebody tried to eradicate her. Her images were defaced, and it was a whole kind of family, brother-in-law, squabble for power or something. But anyway, so they lost the mummy for a while. And this chief Egyptologist, at one point in this film, and I love to show this film to my students because he says, in my innermost being, I know which mummy that is, but I can't depend on that. I have to be scientific. So they had to go to each of these mummies and do the DNA, and also the position of the arm, the royalty. If it was down here, that would not be royalty. She was royalty. All of this stuff. And yet he said, I know which one it is. I know which, but I cannot stop there. So just saying what our intuitions are telling us, and saying, but I have to. I have to be scientific. Just one word, I'm glad you brought that up. There is a handbook of qualitative research. It's an edited volume. It's in about its 6th edition, and it has, it's very, very expensive, even as an ebook, but you might be able to buy one for the library. Also, there are large portions of all of the editions you can read on Google Books online free of charge, like just portions. You can at least get the table of contents in the first few articles. And they have all sorts of qualitative research examples. They have the history of qualitative research methods. They have the use of narrative. There's a chapter on poetics. everything imaginable. That's one thing I would recommend. And the other is a book you can, and your students, anybody can download this free of charge, and I can send the citation. But it's Anthropology, Social Science Research, Principles, Methods, and Practices. And he is not a political scientist. He's more of a management studies person, I think. And but his book is excellent. The last name is Battacherje. It's Battacherje. Battacherje. A-N-O-L. And it's social science research. It is a great handbook. Now, one thing, getting back to this business of subjectivity, he contends in the opening chapter, he differentiates between what he calls the soft sciences and the hard sciences. He differentiates between social sciences and natural and physical sciences. He says that the latter are more precise. You know, that's the difference. Social sciences, we deal with human nature, it's what you said. And, you know, hard sciences, and I know in psychology you really have both, right? Because it's medicine, so you're dealing with that. But I would venture to say, this is where I respectfully will disagree with at least the extent to which Battacherje differentiates. Because I have a friend and colleague, I haven't talked to him in a long time, who's a number theorist. I would invite anybody to ask him if number science is absolute. Number theorists are always looking at other ways to define numbers. They're absolute to us because they've become a paradigm, you might say. Music theory in the West is different than music theory in India, where you have about 25 quarter tones in between each of our half tones. So even these precise things are not, they have become precise by a kind of consensus. And I will just give one example. Again, going back to these pre-20th century African women leaders, one of them was a mystic from what is now Angola, it was the Kingdom of the Congo, 18th century. She was a mystic that believed that Christianity, because the Congolese became Christian, Portuguese arrived early, they converted, and she was Christian, but she believed that Jesus had been born in the Kingdom of the Congo long ago, and she wanted to restore Christianity to its Kingdom of Congolese roots. Well, you can imagine how that went over with the Portuguese. She was burned at the stake. That was the very bad news. She also didn't handle this very well. She would go into these trances, and her biographer, John Thornton, who teaches at Boston University, my student, he was talking with us about this business of mental illness, and this is important because when you're talking about subjectivity, in the 18th century, of course, people considered her mad. Her followers considered her mystical, having a direct communication with God. Okay, you know, this question is, if you've ever seen Pentecostals who were slain in the spirit, they started speaking in tongues. Some psychologists would say this is self-induced hysteria. People who believe in this say this is the spirit talking. Okay, so which is the science? Which is the, you know, and where does culture, and that's something we talked about last night, where does culture come into play? Do you say, okay, science says this is hysteria and it's a disorder? Well, what if this person, prophets in the Bible, those same people will say, oh, the great prophets of the Bible. You go back and read, John the Baptist was walking around and eating locusts and wild honey and saying, repent, repent. I mean, you know, there are people in Times Square in New York City that go around with the Bible saying, repent, repent, and people think of them as deranged street people. Okay? Well, John the Baptist probably looked, maybe not even that reputable, okay? So, you know, we have to be careful about how these evaluations come about. And so, just to answer your question, I think the most we can do is recognize the subjectivity, maybe honor it, but watch out that we are not pulling unfair biases into it. So it's a balancing act. Yeah.
Madam, you have not told about the author of the editor of the first one.
Oh, it's a whole group of, the last name of one of the principal authors, she's not everyone, is Lincoln, L-I-N-C-O-L-A, Veronica, what is it? It starts with, yeah, you know that one, yeah, it's that whole series. And the older ones are, it started in 1994, I believe, and the older ones are less expensive and they're still as valuable, they just may be outdated as far as the state of the art. Yeah. Other